Over the decades, both superpowers toyed with wild ideas to further militarize space, from orbital weapons platforms to anti-satellite missiles, but many of these schemes proved too difficult or expensive. By the 1990s, with the Soviet Union's collapse, the urgency of space warfare faded for a time. Why spend billions on elaborate space weapons when the main adversary was gone? Fast forward to the present day, and two major shifts have brought space back to the forefront of military planning. The threat is back, and access to space has gotten a lot cheaper. New geopolitical rivalries have emerged, with countries like China rapidly expanding their space and missile capabilities. And at the same time, the cost of launching satellites has plummeted thanks to innovations by private companies like SpaceX. To appreciate the change in cost and activity, just look at the number of satellites in orbit. In April 2020, there were only about 2,666 operational satellites circling Earth. By early 2024, that number had exploded to over 9,500 satellites, and it continues to rise steeply. As of mid-2025, estimates put the count above 12,000 active satellites. This surge is largely driven by commercial mega constellations like SpaceX's Starlink, which have made it dramatically cheaper to put hardware in orbit. The trend is so dramatic that astronomers have complained about swarms of satellites photobombing the night sky and interfering with telescopes. This new reality has prompted military and political leaders to act. In 2019, the United States formally created the U.S. Space Force, the first new branch of the U.S. military in over 70 years, explicitly declaring space to be a warfighting domain on par with land, air, sea, and cyber. Other nations have taken note. China established its own Space Force in 2023-24, and countries like Russia, India, and France have all set up dedicated military space units or commands. The message is clear. Controlling space is now seen as vital to national security. Before diving into how nations plan to fight in space, let's first look at how they use space right now in modern warfare. Satellites orbiting Earth serve as the invisible nervous system of modern militaries. They allow countries to see, hear, navigate, and communicate across the globe in ways that were impossible in earlier eras. Here are the primary ways space assets are used in warfare today. Surveillance and reconnaissance. Perhaps the most well-known role of military satellites is spying, observing what's happening on the ground. High-resolution imaging satellites can photograph enemy troop movements, bases, missile sites, and more. For example, commercial satellite photos in early 2022 revealed Russia massing troops and tanks along Ukraine's border, providing critical warning of the impending invasion. These orbiting eyes are so advanced that it's becoming very hard for any nation to keep military activities secret. Even a closed-off country like North Korea can be studied via satellite maps. Analysts have identified everything from nuclear test sites to submarine bases just by scouring imagery. Modern systems go beyond pictures. They can detect heat signatures, say the hot plume of a missile launch, and other electromagnetic signals. In fact, the US and other powers maintain satellites specifically to watch for the infrared flash of missile launches worldwide, acting as an early warning if anyone fires a rocket or missile. Missile early warning. As mentioned, satellites equipped with infrared sensors stare down at the Earth, looking for the telltale heat plume of a missile launch. During the Cold War, the US and USSR Russia deployed early warning satellite constellations to detect intercontinental ballistic missiles. Today, early warning satellites are more important than ever, especially with new hypersonic missiles in development. The US is currently upgrading its aging missile warning system by launching a constellation of dozens of smaller satellites in low Earth orbit through the Space Development Agency to track advanced threats like hypersonic glide vehicles. If a hostile missile is detected, these satellites cue missile defense systems on the ground to intercept it in time. Russia, China, and others have their own early warning satellites on a smaller scale, since no nuclear power wants to be caught off guard by a potential strike. Navigation, GPS, the Global Positioning System, and similar satellite navigation constellations, like Russia's GLONASS or Europe's Galileo, are the unsung heroes of modern military operations. GPS satellites transmit precise timing and location signals that allow troops, ships, aircraft, and missiles to know exactly where they are. Accurate navigation and positioning enable smart bombs to hit their targets, units in the field to maneuver effectively, and logistics to flow smoothly. It's hard to overstate how much militaries rely on satellite navigation. Without it, soldiers might have to literally pull out paper maps and compasses to figure out their location. Space assets today allow a military to see the enemy, detect incoming attacks, navigate precisely, and communicate securely across long distances. They function like a central nervous system connecting all the pieces of a modern fighting force. But this also creates a vulnerability. If those satellites go down, the nervous system is severed. An enemy that can blind your satellites, shut down your GPS, or cut off your communications can effectively cripple your ability to fight. A US Space Force official described it vividly. Without space, a 21st century military military could quickly find itself operating like it's the mid-20th century again. Smart weapons wouldn't work right, units could get lost, and coordination would break down. There have been glimpses of this in recent conflicts. For instance, Russian electronic jamming in Ukraine has at times disrupted GPS-guided munitions, causing bombs to miss targets and forcing Ukraine to devise workarounds. Given how crucial satellites are, it's no wonder that world powers are aggressively developing ways to attack each other's space systems. In fact, according to US military officials, attacks in space are already happening every day, though these are mostly subtle, non-destructive attacks for now. Let's examine the kinds of space warfare that are underway. Stealth attacks in space, jamming, spoofing, and cyber warfare. When we talk about space attacks, short of blowing satellites to smithereens, we're usually referring to electronic and cyber interference. These methods aim to disable or mislead space systems without creating debris or making a big boom, making them somewhat deniable and less likely to spark a severe escalation. Here are the common forms of such non-kinetic space attacks. Radio jamming. This is like shouting over someone so they can't be heard. Ground stations and users communicate with satellites via radio signals. An attacker can blast a satellite's frequency with a much stronger noise signal, drowning out the legitimate communications. If a GPS satellite signal is jammed, receivers on the ground might suddenly lose their position accuracy. Jamming can be localized. For example, Russia has heavily jammed GPS signals around battle zones in Ukraine. It's an effective way to deny services without touching the satellite itself. If your troops can't receive the satellite's data, it's as bad as the satellite being down. Spoofing. A more insidious cousin of jamming, spoofing involves trickery rather than brute force. Here, an attacker emits fake signals that mimic the real ones a satellite sends. The goal is to mislead the satellite or its receivers. For instance, GPS spoofing can make a navigation system believe it's in a different location. In one case, ships near a Russian port suddenly showed their GPS location dozens of miles inland, likely due to spoofing. In a military context, an attacker could spoof a satellite's control signals, perhaps trying to send it erroneous commands or cause it to go off course. It's like hacking the conversation between a satellite and ground, causing confusion. Laser dazzling, blinding. Yes, lasers are part of the space war toolkit, though not the Hollywood pew-pew type. Powerful ground-based lasers can be aimed at optical satellites, those with cameras, to flash chalk blind their sensors. A low-power laser can temporarily saturate an imaging satellite's sensors, dazzling it so it can't take a clear picture, while a more powerful laser could potentially permanently damage the optics if concentrated enough. These lasers don't zap the satellite Star Wars style. Instead, they act like shining a flashlight into someone's camera, ruining the shot. Both Russia and China are reported to have built laser stations for this purpose, to protect high-value sites from prying eyes in the sky. Cyber attacks, hacking. Perhaps the most covert method is to hack the satellite systems or the computers on the ground that control it. We saw a dramatic example at the outset of the Ukraine war in 2022. Just hours before the invasion, Russian hackers launched a cyber attack against a commercial satellite internet network, Viasat, that Ukrainian forces were using. Over 10,000 satellite modems were knocked offline in one blow, cutting off communications for troops and civilians. A Ukrainian official later described this sudden outage as catastrophic, as it disrupted command and control at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, leaked US intelligence has revealed that China is developing a sophisticated cyber weapon aimed at satellites. The goal is to hijack enemy satellites outright, to seize control and render them useless for communications or surveillance during a conflict. In other words, instead of blowing up the satellite, just hack it so it no longer obeys its operators on the ground. For the record, the US hasn't publicly admitted to having such a capability, but it would be naive to think Western cyber warriors aren't exploring similar possibilities. In 2023, during an armed rebellion by the Wagner mercenary group in Russia, a hacker collective sympathetic to Wagner hijacked a Russian satellite communication network, knocking it offline for days. Many analysts suspect Ukrainian hackers posing as Wagner were actually behind it, but either way, it showed how cyber attacks can target SATCOM infrastructure. That same year, Chinese-linked hackers infiltrated Japan's space agency networks in an apparent espionage campaign, prompting Tokyo to bolster its cyber defenses for space systems. The bottom line, the soft fight in space is already happening every single day, largely hidden from public view. But what about the more spectacular side of space warfare? The prospect of shooting down satellites or blowing things up in orbit. Those scenarios are the stuff of many sci-fi imaginings, and they're not as far-fetched as they once were. Sooner or later, any discussion of military space rivalry comes around to kinetic attacks, destroying or physically damaging satellites and other space assets. This is the more movie-like vision of space war, involving missiles, explosions, and even satellites fighting each other. While nations have good reason to be cautious about blasting satellites due to orbital debris risks, they have nonetheless developed and tested several methods of doing just that. Let's break down the known or suspected capabilities. Striking ground stations. One straightforward way to take a satellite offline is to target the ground facilities that control or rely on it. After all, a satellite is useless if it can't exchange data with Earth. Military satellites depend on ground ground antennas and control centers. These sites could be bombed, hit with missiles, or attacked by special forces in a conflict. We've already seen this to some degree. Ukraine, for instance, has launched drone strikes against Russian long-range early warning radar stations, facilities that are part of Russia's space-based missile detection network. In May 2023, Ukrainian drones hit the Voronezh DM early warning radar in Russia's Krasnodar region, damaging at least one giant radar antenna. Ukraine also struck another Russian radar site at Orsk, though that one didn't show clear damage. These attacks were essentially Ukraine's way of poking out Russia's eyes that watch for missiles. And in 2022, a suspected Ukrainian attack in Crimea took out a Russian satellite communication center used for controlling military satellites, showing that ground infrastructure for space systems is very much a wartime target. Several countries have demonstrated the ability to shoot down satellites from the ground using missiles. The United States first did this back in 1985, when an Air Force jet launched a missile that struck an old scientific satellite in a test. China grabbed headlines and international condemnation in 2007 by blasting one of its own defunct weather satellites into pieces with a missile, creating a cloud of debris that is still orbiting today. In 2019, India conducted a similar test, destroying a low-orbit satellite to prove it has space weapons. And in November 2021, Russia fired a missile that obliterated one of its unused satellites, generating at least 2,500 pieces of trackable debris in orbit at similar altitude to the International Space Station. That Russian test was widely criticized because the debris threatened other satellites and forced ISS astronauts to shelter. The United States has since declared a moratorium on such destructive tests, urging others to do the same. These ASAT missile tests are usually done under the guise of hitting one's own satellite. No one has yet shot down someone else's satellite in peacetime. But the message is clear. If we can destroy our satellite, we could destroy yours too. The big downside of these attacks is debris. After Russia's 2021 test, US officials blasted the move as reckless for endangering the space environment.
What the Russians did today with these 1,500 pieces of trackable orbital debris poses a risk not only to those astronauts, not only to those cosmonauts, but to satellites, to the interests of all nations.
The most intriguing and complex form of space combat involves one satellite physically approaching and interfering with another. This isn't the Star Wars style dogfighting with laser cannons. It's more like a slow orbital tango. If satellites are like race cars speeding around a track, a co-orbital attack is like one car pulling up next to another and forcing it off the road, but at 28,000 km per hour and in the vacuum of space. Both Russia and China have been testing such capabilities. China launched a satellite called Shijian-21 SJ-21 in late 2021, officially to demonstrate space debris cleanup. In January 2022, SJ-21 did something remarkable. It rendezvoused in geostationary orbit with a derelict Chinese satellite, latched onto it with a robotic arm, and towed it out to a graveyard orbit above GEO. This was a genuine feat of engineering, matching orbits and docking with an object in the vastness of space. And China touted it as a peaceful debris removal test. But military observers noted that the exact same capability could be used offensively. A spacecraft that can grab and move satellites could just as easily shove an enemy satellite into a wrong orbit, or even fling it down toward Earth's atmosphere. US Space Force officials openly stated that China's experiment showed a potential for dogfighting in space, satellites maneuvering unpredictably around others in a sort of orbital cat and mouse. In 2020, a pair of Russian satellites, Cosmos 2542, 2543, trailed a US spy satellite coming uncomfortably close, which prompted the US State Department to complain. Then, one of those Russian satellites released a small projectile in orbit, essentially firing a bullet in space. Russia claimed it was just a small satellite deployment, but the US called it a suspicious ASAT weapons test in orbit. According to a senior US general, in 2019, a Russian satellite had approached a US reconnaissance satellite so closely that operators worried an attack was imminent. These incidents illustrate that orbital maneuvers can be threatening even if no shots are fired. A satellite that sidles up to another could potentially use various methods to disable it, jamming it at point-blank range, spraying it with opaque materials, damaging its sensors, or using a mechanical arm to tamper with it. One ominous concept discussed in Chinese military writings is a small explosive charge or satellite bomb that could be attached to a target's engine nozzle and detonated later. The possibilities for orbital sabotage are endless once you can get close to your target. It's worth noting that the United States likely has its own co-orbital capabilities, though details are secret. The US operates the X-37B, a reusable unmanned spaceplane that looks like a miniature space shuttle. Officially, the X-37B is for testing technologies in orbit, and it has done long-duration flights, over 900 days, carrying various experiments. In one mission, it tested a new system to convert solar energy to microwave power in space, potentially a step towards space-based solar power. But the X-37B's exact activities often remain classified, fueling speculation that it could be a platform for on-orbit espionage or even offensive actions. It could, for instance, deploy small satellites or inspect other objects in orbit. China has noted this and in turn developed its own secretive, reusable spaceplane, which has flown at least twice in 2020 and 2023. Again, details unknown. The mere existence of these craft shows how major powers are investing in more maneuverable, versatile space vehicles that could one day be used in conflicts. A discussion about space weapons often brings up wild ideas like orbital bombardment, the notion of dropping kinetic projectiles from orbit, sometimes nicknamed rods from God, to hit targets on Earth with enormous speed. This concept was examined during the Cold War and periodically resurfaces. Essentially, a satellite would release a tungsten rod or similar, letting gravity accelerate it to impact like a meteor. While very destructive, no country is known to have deployed such a system. It would violate treaties and be technically challenging. However, in recent years, there has been talk in US defense circles about reviving space-based missile defense interceptors. Under the Trump administration, officials and reportedly Elon Musk as a contractor discussed an American Iron Dome in space, a network of interceptors that could shoot down missiles in their launch phase from orbit. This harkens back to Reagan's 1980s Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative, which included a concept called Brilliant Pebbles, hundreds of small hunter-killer satellites to take out ICBMs in flight. With modern tech and lower launch costs, some in Washington believe this could finally be feasible. Of course, if you put missile-killing weapons in space, they could potentially also be used to target satellites, depending on their design. As of now, no country has openly deployed weapons in space, defined as devices intended to destroy targets, as opposed to, say, a surveillance satellite. But the line can blur. If the US or others proceed with orbital missile interceptors in the future, it could mark the first placement of dedicated armaments in orbit. Finally, a chilling category of space weapon is one that we hope remains only hypothetical: nuclear weapons in orbit. Early in the Cold War, both superpowers toyed with the idea of placing nukes in space, either as orbital bombs that could be dropped from above or warheads that could be detonated in space to fry enemy satellites with radiation, EMP. In 1962, both the US and USSR actually detonated nuclear devices at high altitude, the US Starfish Prime test and the Soviet Test 184 a couple months later. The results were dramatic. The EMP from Starfish Prime knocked out streetlights in Hawaii 900 miles away and disabled at least a third of all satellites in low Earth orbit at the time. Basically, a nuclear burst in space could wreak havoc on unshielded satellites over a wide area via radiation and electromagnetic effects, without the immediate blast being felt on the ground. Recognizing how dangerous this was, world powers signed the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which bans the placement of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. That treaty, joined by over 100 nations, has, so far, kept space free of nukes.
We are taking the first firm step toward keeping outer space free forever from the implements of war.
Even during the tensest years of the Cold War, neither side actually stationed nuclear bombs in orbit full-time. However, recent accusations suggest this taboo may be under strain. In February 2023, US intelligence publicly warned that Russia is developing a new anti-satellite weapon that involves a nuclear device in space. This could mean a specialized warhead intended to be detonated in orbit to destroy satellites via EMP. Exactly what the Outer Space Treaty forbids. The US said such a device, if deployed, would violate the treaty and posed a grave threat to the roughly 9,500 satellites now in orbit, civilian and military alike. Russia denied it has any plan to weaponize space with nukes, but when the issue was brought to the United Nations in April 2024, some revealing diplomacy took place. The US and Japan proposed a simple Security Council resolution to reaffirm the 1967 treaty's ban on nuclear arms in space, essentially asking everyone to recommit to no nukes in orbit. Russia vetoed that resolution to the dismay of other nations. In response, Russia, with some support from China, countered with a broader proposal, a resolution to ban all weapons in space for all time. Not just WMD, but any weapons. This might sound good, but the US and allies saw it as a cynical ploy, since Russia has been developing non-nuclear space weapons for years. The US and others did not support Russia's draft. It failed to pass, and each side accused the other of hypocrisy. American officials essentially said, if Russia truly isn't putting nukes in space, why veto our narrow resolution? What are you hiding? Meanwhile, Russia argued, the US refusal to ban all space weapons shows they want an arms race in space. The back and forth at the UN highlights an unsettling reality. There is currently no broad international agreement preventing the weaponization of space beyond the narrow ban on WMD. Decades ago, the US and USSR decided not to pursue orbital nukes, and that gentleman's agreement held. But today, as more players enter the space arena and conventional military reliance on satellites grows, we're seeing a slow-motion arms race. The US, Russia, and China are each enhancing their ability to attack satellites and protect their own, albeit in different ways. New technologies, from AI-directed satellite swarms to on-orbit servicing robots that double as potential weapons, are emerging. The new arms race and the path ahead space is getting crowded and contested. In many ways, we're in the early stages of a 21st century arms race in orbit, one that involves dazzling lasers, hacking, high-speed interceptors, and even experimental space planes. All the major military powers understand the value of dominating the high ground of space, and none want to be caught lagging. China, for instance, is rapidly ramping up its military space capabilities, launching more satellites, testing advanced anti-satellite systems, and integrating space into its military doctrine. The United States, which has long held the edge in space, is investing heavily to stay ahead, partnering with commercial giants like SpaceX to deploy next-gen satellite networks that can surveil the globe in real time, and quietly developing its own resilient, possibly more secretive space hardware. Russia, with a legacy of space tech but fewer resources today, is nonetheless trying to leverage asymmetric tricks like novel nuclear-powered systems or electronic warfare to remain a threat. The worry is that without some kind of understanding or restraint, a future crisis on Earth could quickly escalate into conflict in space. If, say, a war broke out, each side might attempt to blind the other's satellites through jamming or cyber at first, but perhaps via missiles or co-orbital attacks if the war intensified. The result could be a mess. Crucial satellite services knocked out, debris clouds making orbits hazardous, and even spillover effects on civilian infrastructure. Imagine your GPS navigation or satellite TV failing because of what's happening above. Despite these risks, there is hope for keeping space peaceful, at least to some degree. It lies in diplomacy and recognition of mutual interest. Space, unlike battlefields on Earth, has no borders or populations. It truly is a global commons. A war in space that creates tons of debris would harm everyone, including neutral countries and commercial companies. There's a growing chorus of voices urging new international rules to prevent the most destabilizing actions. For example, after the outcry over the 2021 Russian ASAT test, multiple countries have discussed banning debris causing ASAT tests. The US has self-imposed this ban, and others may follow. There have been proposals for no first use of space weapons pledges, agreements to protect certain satellites, like those that provide worldwide services, or even joint norms for responsible behavior in orbit. As of now, though, concrete agreements are lacking. The major powers continue to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The United States even created a dedicated military branch, the Space Force, to ensure it can fight and win in space if it ever had to. Military exercises increasingly include space components and general speak of space superiority much as they do air superiority. We are, for better or worse, entering an era where any serious global conflict will extend to space, because knocking out the enemy's satellites might be the key to victory on the ground. Avoiding catastrophe will require these nations to talk to each other and establish some guardrails. As one US official said, it's in no one's interest to turn space into a shooting gallery. The orbits around Earth are too important to all of us for weather, communications, commerce, science to make it a war zone. Even during the Cold War, adversaries managed to negotiate arms control for nuclear weapons. Perhaps a similar effort can be made for space weapons before it's too late. Coming years will determine whether space remains a realm of relative cooperation and stability, or whether it becomes an active theater of military confrontation. Humanity's dependence on space is only growing, and with it grows the incentive to both protect and, in conflict, to attack that dependence. The hope is that cooler heads will prevail and recognize that a war in space has no real winners. For now, we must face the reality that the high ground of orbit is militarily crucial and thus hotly contested. The next time conflict sparks on Earth, don't be surprised if the opening shots or hacks or jamming signals are fired in the silent darkness of space, hundreds of kilometers above our heads. Ultimately, the goal should be to ensure that space is free from the implements of war, as envisioned decades ago, because weaponizing the heavens benefits no one in the long run. Until global powers come to an understanding, however, the quiet arms race in orbit will continue, and militaries will prepare for battles in this final frontier. Space, once the domain of dreamers and explorers, is now firmly part of the security landscape here on Earth. And as the countless satellites above help guide armies and inform leaders, they also remind us how interconnected and fragile our modern world can be. Balanced on technology, orbiting in the darkness, vulnerable, and in need of wise stewardship rather than reckless conflict.